there is always inspiration behind an idea to do something, and particularly one like this. A woman who is a member of our board, a longtime member of our board, cares deeply about art in our lives and education. And she is the inspiration. She's one of the very first people I spoke to when I came to Washington, and she is the chair of our event. I'd like to introduce you to Betsy DeVos.
Thank you so much, Deborah. And I'd like to echo the warm welcome that's already been given to all of you as we gather here today for this really special occasion. The collection of experts that have come together today here is exceptional, and the topics we are going to cover are significant. I am thrilled to be included amongst such an august group, and I expect we'll all leave this afternoon filled with new ideas, creative connections, and a recommitment to the unmatched value of the arts. I see evidence of that value every day in my education work. Students everywhere benefit from experiencing the arts. Complex concepts become clear, critical information is strangely easier to remember, learning becomes more interesting, and curiosity is cultivated. And I'd like to think that we're all still students, with the same benefits inuring to all of us. We're assembled here in our country's National Performing Arts Center, but it's also the memorial to our 35th president. And President and Mrs. Kennedy were arts aficionados and enthusiasts. As President Kennedy once noted, if art is to nourish the roots of our society, society must set the artist free to follow his vision wherever it takes him. I have to think that President Kennedy would be thrilled to be here today to participate in this summit. The perspectives of our speakers are windows into the challenges that we address as a society. And as is outlined in today's program, education, race, technological advances, and free speech are just a few of the issues illuminated and impacted by both practitioners and appreciative consumers of the arts. So how can we address and embrace that impact? How can we harness that power? How can art really make a difference? These and many other questions will be explored and be a focus of our conversations today. I, for one, am eager to see what the day holds. While I mention making a difference, it does give me great pleasure to introduce a man who personally makes an enormous difference and who really needs no introduction, especially if you watched 60 Minutes a couple of weeks ago. David Rubenstein is an exceptional person. He's that rare combination of unbridled energy, unparalleled business acumen, an extraordinary philanthropic spirit, and a really nice guy. I'm privileged to call him a friend, and am very honored to introduce him here today. Ladies and gentlemen, the chairman of the John F. Kennedy Performing Center for the Arts, David Rubenstein.
I'm inspired to dance after having seen that performance, but the last time I danced in public was my bar mitzvah, and there's been no demand since then for me to dance. When our country was created, there was a feeling that we should have a performing arts be part of it, and the arts be part of it. And actually, in the original design for the city of Washington, Pierre L'Enfant, hired by George Washington, actually created a national cultural center. And it was part of the original design. And it was Pierre L'Enfant's view that how could you have a city like Washington be a grand city like London and Paris, which was George Washington's view, if you don't actually have a cultural center there. And so it was put right in there, and actually was put on the Grand Avenue, now called Pennsylvania Avenue. But Pierre L'Enfant got fired, and we ran out of money, and we were barely able to build the city, so it got pushed aside, as often happens, unfortunately, with the arts, it gets pushed aside. And so it didn't happen, and so we didn't really have a performing arts center for quite some time, and many other theaters arose. They were built by entrepreneurs. The most famous of them, of course, is Ford's Theater. And then eventually in the 1930s, 1940s, Eleanor Roosevelt really pushed to have a national cultural center, a national performing arts center. And finally, in 1958, legislation was signed by President Eisenhower, who also was a supporter, to build a performing arts center in Washington, and it would be the National Cultural Center, as it was called. It was supposed to be funded only by private sector money. So from 1958 through 1961, when President Kennedy took office, a total of $13,000 was raised. Not enough to build a performing arts center. So President Kennedy decided he would really do something about it. And in talking about it, he said we need to have this because the truth is when civilization the history is past, what people will remember more about our civilization is not what victories or defeats we have in politics or in battle, but really what the spirit of our civilization is all about. And so we need to have a national cultural center. And he really brought down a man from New York, Roger Stevens, who began national telethons to raise money. And in fact, recently Yo-Yo Ma pointed out that he was actually participating in one as a 7 or 8-year-old boy. And they raised about $1 million in one of the telethons. Unfortunately, they didn't really raise enough to get it done. And then when President Kennedy was assassinated, his family, because of his commitment to this area, decided that the appropriate way to memorialize President Kennedy through a living memorial was to build the Kennedy Center, as it was later called, the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. It actually cost about $70 million to build. $35 million came from the government and $35 million from private citizens around the world. And today, we are a performing arts center and an arts education center. When I think back on it, what President Kennedy wanted to do was something that the founders of our country really wanted to do. And as I visualize it, and the way I look at it, I just like you to think about this. President Kennedy made a speech in May of 1961 before the joint session of Congress. And he said, I want to challenge Americans to get to the moon before the end of this century, before this end of this decade. And you all know we did in 1969. We landed 2 men on the moon. And before that, though, that was Apollo 11. Some of you may remember that. But there was a previous voyage to the moon to see whether we could actually get to the moon and back, and it was called Apollo 8. Jim Lovell was in that, and Frank Borman was in that mission as well. And some of you may be old enough to remember this. It was the first time that man had left the orbit of the Earth and was heading to the orbit of another body. And when they got to the moon, they circled around the back of the moon, and no one had ever seen the backside of the moon. No one knew whether they would come back from the backside of the moon. And after circling around this 4 times, they circled 10 times before they came back to Earth. On the 4th time around, on Christmas Day in 1968, they saw for the first time what the Earth looked like in space. They saw the first Earthrise, and the first time anybody had ever seen, any human had ever seen what Earth looked like. And Jim Lovell took pictures of it, and others took pictures of it. And you may recall that on that inspirational time, they began to read from the Bible. They said, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And clearly, for the first time, humans had seen Earth, what God had created from this perspective. And when Jim Lovell was looking at it, you may remember from seeing the movie Apollo 13, he put his thumb up. And he kind of said, wow, isn't it interesting? I have the entire Earth, all of civilization, everything we've created, really so small that it's behind my thumb. And when you think about it, what God created in the heaven and earth in 6 days, really, and then he rested on the 7th, is a pretty impressive thing. He had no authorizing committees. He had no appropriation committees he had to deal with. So it was, impressive to do that. Had he had authorizing and appropriating committees to deal with, he probably would have taken a few years to get it done. But he did it in 6 days and rested on the 7th. And when you think back on what did God do that was so amazing, what did he create? Well, the most amazing thing he put on the earth, in my view, was the human brain. You think about all the things on the face of the earth, all the great things that are here. What is the most amazing thing? It's the human brain. Because this organ is able to create culture, civilization, all the things that humans have created in the thousands of years that we've really had civilization. And when you think about it, one of the most important things that all of us care about is the thing that the human brain has done, which is to create art and performing arts, visual arts, literature, all the kinds of things that make civilization so important and make life so enjoyable. And what distinguishes us from animals on the earth? Well, we've created a culture because we've used our brain to be able to do things that elevate the human spirit. And that's what really makes culture so important. And actually, when our country was founded, the people who founded our country, they didn't see politics here and economics here and culture here. They saw people having everything together. And so the founding fathers were not people who viewed arts as off to the side, something that would be dealt with as an addendum to something else, something whose budget could be cut when no other money was available for things. They would just cut the budget of arts. They didn't look at it that way. They viewed that arts was an essential part of one's DNA. So as Walter knows, Benjamin Franklin, important thing among other things he did was play music. It was very important to him. In fact, he created his own musical instrument for which Mozart and Beethoven composed pieces. George Washington, known as an austere military general, well, the great love of his life was actually going to shows, going to operas. And in fact, the greatest gift that he could give to people, he thought, was giving them a ticket to see a show. And in fact, he loved dancing. He might not have been able to do what we just saw, but he was famous as a dancer. In fact, so famous his wife may not have been as happy about it all the time because he tended to dance with very young ladies many times for 1 or 2 hours at a time. He was quite an indefatigable dancer. And then there is Thomas Jefferson. There is no one quite like him. President Kennedy famously said in a dinner when all the Nobel Prize winners who in the United States had gathered once that there had not been so much talent in the White House since Thomas Jefferson dined alone. And why did he say that? He said that because Thomas Jefferson was a vintner, he was a bibliophile, he was an agronomist, he was an artist, he was an architect, and he was a musician. And Thomas Jefferson would say the greatest pleasure of his life was playing music. As a young boy, he practiced violin 3 hours a day. And when he was wooing his wife, Martha, he spent much of the time doing it by playing the violin. She played the harpsichord. And one time, when some other men who wanted to woo her as well came to her house, they heard him playing the violin and her playing the harpsichord, and it was so beautiful, and they were singing as well, they realized their chance of wooing her was gone, and they left. It is said by Thomas Jefferson's grandchildren that the greatest things they used to do and the greatest pleasure was when he taught them music, and he insisted his own children learn how to play music. And whenever he was riding, whenever he was walking, he was singing. He didn't just walk in solitary by himself, he was singing. And he often did enormous amounts of things to make other people understand the beauty of music. Now, it's probably unrealistic that we're going to have another Thomas Jefferson be elected President of the United States. Thomas Jefferson probably couldn't be elected President of the United States today. For all of his talents and brilliance, he had a high-pitched, squeaky voice, and he virtually never talked in public. In fact, in 8 years as president, he only made one public speech. He was a little shy in that way, but he was great in other respects. But while we're not likely to have another Thomas Jefferson, we can have leaders, I think, who care about the arts and care about culture, who recognize that this country is dependent on and really founded by people who care about the arts, and we shouldn't shunt the arts aside. Now, recently I made some remarks at a place called Iwo Jima Memorial. It's a memorial to the Marine Corps in our country for people who've fallen in combat and were given the last full measure of devotion, as Lincoln would say. And those people who give their lives for our country clearly are patriots. And those people who are political leaders are clearly patriots as well in many cases. But those of you who fight for culture are, in my view, cultural patriots. And I think that all of you here and all those around the country who fight to make sure people understand the importance of arts and culture are as patriotic as the people who serve in our military or people who serve in our government. So I want to thank all of you for what you are doing to help make sure people in the United States recognize that we aren't a country where you can separate the culture from the politics and economics. Everything is together. It's part of our DNA. And if we're going to be a great country and we're going to have a country that civilization will remark upon about how great it is centuries from now, it has to be one where our culture is featured. And so we have to promote young artists. We have to educate people who are not artists, but educate them about the value of arts. Let me just conclude by saying something that I'd like to quote President Kennedy about. President Kennedy, in his famous inaugural address, some of you may remember this, in 1961 on January 20th, he gave a speech that was the greatest speech he ever gave. And he said in about this 14 minutes, of course, the famous line, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." And I think all of you are doing that as well when you're helping your country by promoting the cultural arts and the civilization that is so important to our society. But at the end of that speech, he said, "With a good conscience, our only sure reward with history the final judge of our deeds, let us go forth to lead the land we love, asking his blessing and his help, but knowing that here on earth, God's work must truly be our own. What I think you're doing to help promote culture is really God's work on earth, and I want to thank you on behalf of the Kennedy Center for everything you're doing, and thank you for being here. Thank you. My pleasure to introduce, is it Howard Gardner now? Howard Gardner, Howard, there you are. Howard is one of our great scholars in the country, a professor at Harvard, and a person who knows more about the culture than probably everybody else here put together, because he's done more research on it than anybody. Howard Gardner, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Damian. And good morning. Can you hear me? Okay. It's coming. The sound is coming. The seventh day. Testing? Better? Okay. As you can see for yourself, I've been around for a long time. And I've been in arts education for a long time, for decades. As a youngster growing up in Scranton, Pennsylvania, I sat at home and watched a conductor named Leonard Bernstein introduce me and millions of other youngsters to orchestral classical music. I brought along two high-tech exhibits. This is number one. This is Leonard Bernstein on television in the 1950s. It's available online. And this was arts education circa 1955. Then, as a graduate student half a century ago, I was a founding member of Harvard Project Zero, a group that has long focused on education in the arts. Shortly thereafterwards, I was a witness testifying to a panel on arts education assembled by the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. RBF issued a report called Coming to Our Senses, S-E-N-S-E-S. I wonder how many of you remember that report? Very few. This was the cover of the report. And the report sharply focused on what can and should be done in the schools. And that was arts education in the United States circa 1975. Of course, it's 40 years later. What would happen if the proverbial visitor from another planet, who had not been here for 40 years, were to come to the United States to look at education in the arts? Let's say he was a journalist from Mars, or if you prefer, she was a journalist from Venus. Alas, the journalist can't come from a planet named Pluto anymore. That's also changed in the recent decades. The journalist would come here equipped with the classical journalistic questions, and here's the answers I would give in approximately 9 minutes. Why education in the arts? For you at the Kennedy Center today, this question would be easy to answer. You all know about the qualitative transformations and differences that a life in the arts can make, as audience members, as creators, as facilitators. How the arts enrich your experiences and the experiences of those with whom you come into contact. How the arts capture or convey the greatest and most powerful meanings of human existence, what David Rubenstein reminded of us, and what the Romans actually knew, vita breva, ars longa. As to the journalist, I'd say to him, there may be ancillary benefits of the arts, perhaps more motivation to work hard in school, perhaps economic benefits for your community. But I'd add this. I don't know anyone in the arts who engage in artistic practice primarily to raise their IQ or primarily to increase the collectible taxes of their community. And this is an argument for the intrinsic value of arts and culture. Next question, who? The arts used to be primarily for an elite, but now the arts are readily accessible to everyone through work by Damian, Yo-Yo Ma, Jacques d'Amboise, others who we're going to encounter today. We've witnessed the differences that arts can make for young persons. The Rockefeller Brothers Fund knew that. But today, older persons are also a large and growing audience. They, or perhaps we, are much more likely to visit a museum or attend a performance or to take out our own instrument in our later years if we were involved in the arts when we were young. through creating works of art or through courses in school or college. And so that's an important reason why we should think about artistic education as covering the demographic waterfront as a form of lifelong learning, which actually you can do long after you cease being able to run the mile or the marathon. Where? Arts education, as I said, used to be primarily in schools. But despite the valiant efforts of many of you gathered here, the role of arts in schools in America has steadily diminished since the Bernstein 1950s and the RBF 1970s. The Common Core dominates the educational radar screen, and STEM is ubiquitous, not STEAM. But on the positive side, the arts used to be housed primarily in certain institutions and at certain hours. But now you can find the arts everywhere, in community centers, in public places, in the traditional media, on the web, in social media. We have access to the greatest works of all time in multiple media at the touch of a pad, and we can edit, mix, match, mash 24/7. This leaves the question of how. As a scholar working in psychology and education, answering the how question is my daily job. In 1975, Howard Gardner would have talked about the arts as engaging in developing the full range of human intelligences, not just language and logic, which is what we typically test for, but musical, bodily, spatial, personal, and emotional intelligences. As Nelson Goodman, who was the founder of Harvard Project Zero, liked to quip, we don't want education to be half-brained. And you probably know different parts of the brain serve different intelligences. Not only do we want to use the full range of capacities, but we want to be able to connect the intelligences in new and unexpected ways, tangibly and virtually, in school and in the park, on the ground and in cyberspace. There's no need for the arts to hug traditional boundaries, and we got a little taste of that this morning, even a little exercise before the proceedings continued. The Howard Gardner of 2015 is engaged in a national study of collegiate education in the liberal arts and sciences. For Thomas Jefferson, and for those, like the individuals here, who are imbued with his spirit, liberal arts and science education is a form of residential education where the mind and the body and the spirit can wander freely for up to 4 years, opening up possibilities and transformations at the most flexible and freest period of life. Oh, to be 18 again. Yet, as you all know, traditional education in the liberal arts and sciences is in jeopardy because of its expense, because of what I call hyper-vocationalism, and because of various challenges on the campus itself. When our journalist was here 40 years ago, the Academy epitomized C.P. Snow's two cultures. Students either focused on the humanities, typically English or history, or in the sciences. Now the seesaw has tilted sharply toward the sciences, and because of various factors, the humanities are seen as feeble and on the defensive. But there's a silver lining, perhaps even a golden one. I'm convinced that today, the arts can provide a unique and powerful bridge between the humanities and the sciences. And that's because the tools available to creators, digital and tangible, can emanate from anywhere and can be applied anywhere. These tools in media do not respect disciplinary boundaries. They're invariably interdisciplinary. As Walter Isaacson taught us, Steve Jobs moved seamlessly across art, design, technology, and as the many artists and civic artists and citizen artists who are here today remind us, you can work with students and teachers and turn around schools, parks, centers, labs, even apps. These heroic educators don't necessarily use the term art. They can talk about design, making, creating, but in essence, the arts educators of today and of tomorrow are simply human beings using all of their faculties to capture what we know, what we feel, what we value in powerful, indeed unforgettable forms. This is the heartland of the arts. Perhaps, just perhaps, a renewed focus on the arts in our colleges and universities can powerfully bridge the humanities and the sciences and help to reinvigorate the liberal arts education that so many of us cherish. It's an education that's been distinctly American, dating back to our founding fathers, and it's still admired the world over today. And note, if colleges and universities truly value the arts and see them as a bridge, K-12 education will take note. I even have a headline or a tweet for our interdisciplinary journalist. Arts education, from Lenny in the years of music to Leonardo, the universal genius. And so my closing remark to the intrepid visitor: you can take back answers. Compared to decades ago, the arts in the United States are everywhere. They are for everybody. They make use of the huge range of human faculties, and they offer a powerful way to synthesize different perspectives on human existence and human possibilities. The arts can and should be central to education, spanning humanistic and scientific studies from before school throughout life. We, dear journalist, would like to export our knowledge and media to anybody on your planet who's interested in limitless possibilities. In the process, perhaps we'll improve our balance of trade. And if you have products and processes that would fascinate and energize us, sign me up for a visit to your celestial sphere. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to have a discussion following up, so Howard, don't go anywhere. And if we can have Alfre Woodard join us and Camille Zamora. Camille?
Thank you.
So first of all, welcome to Camille and Alfre. We're not going to do bios here. You have them in your book, but just to say, Camille is an incredible opera singer who also founded Sing for Hope, which is an organization based out of New York that galvanizes volunteer art activities, volunteer artists in all fields, not just opera. And in that capacity, I'm proudly served on the board. And they do everything from putting artists in health settings and education settings to putting the pianos out on the streets that, if you've ever been to New York at certain times of the year, you see suddenly a piano appear, and it is art for all in reality. Alfre Woodard needs no introduction, fantastic actor, doing incredible work on stages, on screens, of large and small, and also my fellow turnaround artist. You heard Howard mention the term turnaround. Some of you may know what that's all about. We'll talk about that briefly at some point in definition. But suffice to say, we put ourselves in situations, or I should say we are proud to be allowed to put ourselves in situations where the arts are in schools that are officially failing. And in the effort to turn them around, the arts are being used as a mechanism. And it has been such a success over the last 2 years that it has expanded dramatically. We're lucky to have the president, the leader, Patty Fletcher over here, who makes that happen. And we'll tell you all about what that strategy is. But you know what I want to, Howard, you've set the bar. Thanks. Oh, am I off? Okay, well that's probably why. Okay. You've set the bar at an incredibly high level for us.
Is that meant positively or negatively?
I think it's very positive.
Thank you.
And I want to keep it there a little bit because what I feel is that we could have a discussion about practicalities, like how we do stuff, you know, that could be a one way to go forward, road forward. But we could also look at perhaps what's more necessary as a philosophical underpinning for what it is we're doing. And your journalist from Mars or Venus, depending on the interpretation, you know, gave us a nice metric for that. And it was kind of gloomy at certain moments, I thought. There was a moment that you said, despite all our efforts and the best efforts of many people, you know, this doesn't seem to be taking. But then you said there's a silver lining, that this seems to be a logical bridge between the arts and sciences, between the sciences and the humanities. So therefore, that's possible. So looking at us over here, and what I consider this sort of a panel about artists leading change, sort of. We'd like to, but we need our guidance. Do you think there's a philosophical underpinning that's missing from the arts community itself in this equation you've made from?
I think there are a few things which I don't know whether they're missing, but they may not be underscored enough. One is the idea that you and Yo-Yo and your colleagues have been articulating, which is artists have so much to give, that to come off as people who are petitioners or even beggars and who just want to make sure that they can be employed, even though I don't think that's ever been the headline, I don't think that artists have forefronted enough their desire to be active in the communities, to serve the communities, and particularly underserved populations, as all of you do. And I think that the term civic artists and the embodiment that you all represent is important. And I think, because of, I don't know whether it was President Kennedy or actually Jackie Kennedy, it doesn't matter, but because of the welcoming mat that was done more vividly during the Kennedy administration and in any other administration in my memory, that notion that artists are not only honored but people that can give, I think that's very important. The other two things is that artists are incredible role models. And one of the reasons why artists make a difference in school, when they come to schools or to old age homes, is because you love your work, you live it, you see it as communication, and so many kids nowadays and so many old people feel neglected. They don't feel people looking at them, talking to them, being with them, feeling with them, doing serenade with them. And I think that's another powerful thing that needs to be emphasized. The other thing I tried, I think when you said the high bar, and I quipped in response, the more you understand epistemology, the different ways of knowing, the different ways of being, the different media that are open to you, the more artists, and not just artists, that's why Steve Jobs is such a good example, are people who, artists bring a lot more in your backpack than almost anybody else. And if you're adroit, you can draw on those different things, and that's an incredible message, not for the hand and heart alone, but for the mind. So that may be a longer answer, but those are the things that...
Let me attempt to recap. So the philosophical underpinning you've given us is actually a bit of direction. So for the artists community, you think we serve ourselves better when we present ourselves and act accordingly in terms of giving and not presenting ourselves as being needy and needing.
Giving and embodying.
And embodying, yes. And then from the government side, being in DC particularly relevant, that there's a clear charge and the stage set in terms of a value proposition that you said that was embodied in the Kennedy administration in those words, which we quote so often because they are the preeminent words that encourage this line of thinking. Role modeling. Now, this is not necessarily philosophical underpinning so much as characteristics. Being good role models, artists need to embody that. And then the last thing is, I wrote here, fill your backpacks. To bring the backpack full of the range of possibilities which artists, you believe, have more of than the average person visiting a school. Is that something right?
That's much better than I could have put it. Let me just make one other point, which I've been thinking a lot about recently as I've been visiting colleges and universities. Athletics has a very privileged role in this country, and people don't think twice about paying coaches huge amounts of money and building huge athletic facilities. On the positive side, coaches are often terrific role models for people, and that's one of the reasons why the athletics are genuinely valorized in our country for kids who get to be on teams. Mm-hmm. Thinking about a country as a whole, and Washington in particular, we could learn a lot from the privileged place that athletics has. And I must say, one of the worst things President Obama did was to belittle the study of art history in an unfortunate aside. He did apologize for it, but that's exactly what we don't need, is that kind of gratuitous aspersion.
Okay. But also you're saying that we have a lot to learn from the way athletics are regarded, or by the way they carry themselves?
Regarded in the sense that nobody second guesses putting money in, but also from the role modeling, which good coaches, and they're not all good, the spirits they bring, the sense of responsibility, the cohesion, and so on. And could we have artistic coaches which would be playing an analogous kind of role? I mean, Bernstein did it for the country. He was unusual, but you're unusual too.
Well, that's nice. Thank you. Okay, the high bar continues. Camille, when we first met, I'd known about what you and Monica Eunice did. She's a co-founder, Monica Eunice, another singer. And philosophically, again, looking for a pattern to be expanded on, you guys decided to do something pretty extraordinary at a very young age. And when most, you were at Juilliard when you decided to create Sing for Hope, if I'm correct.
Right.
And, what is that model? Because surely you were worried about getting a job, as vocational, as it were.
Well, I think the model was that there was definitely no model. We had no idea what we were walking into, but I think we had this impulse. And in particular, I thought it was interesting last night, Jane Harmon spoke about the response on Capitol Hill on 9/11, and that there was a moment of sharing song. Monica and I were at Juilliard on 9/11, and it was an interesting morning, to say the least. Shocking, bizarre, and I think everybody who was at school that day spent the rest of the week saying, why on earth am I singing or playing violin? Why am I locking myself in a practice room singing scales? What does this mean in the larger conversation, and how can I help, and how can I make myself feel better? And in the case of Lincoln Center, Juilliard shares its city block with the firehouse there, and they were among the first responders. They lost 11 guys that day, and a couple days later we went and just sang for them. And we weren't thinking about really what we were doing, but we knew that there was this sort of moment that we shared that was really, really important, I think, for everyone. And I think after that, we sort of had this impulse of, how can we, Yo-Yo says it so beautifully, bring arts to the table of social change along with politics and economics. And, I think slowly but surely what we started to realize is art being this endlessly renewable resource, creativity. We, as this artist community in New York, do have some avenues to blaze into these community organizations that might benefit from a shot of art and creativity. And so, kind of, again, without really realizing what we were doing, we started going to schools, hospitals, hospices, bringing songs. It evolved to dance, it evolved to painting. And then in 2010, we started putting pianos in the streets. And, again, with this idea of radical welcome to the arts banquet, and knowing that, it's wonderful when tickets are discounted and when there's the occasional master class, but even beyond that, to go, to the step of putting a hot pink, glittery piano in the middle of the Grand Concourse in the Bronx and saying, this is yours, to really go to that extra step. I think that was really exciting to us.
Wow. I love that concept of radical welcome. I think that's, again, sometimes naming things matters.
Yeah.
And that, to me, if I put that on top of, as a through line to all the activities I do in my day, that changes how I do what I do. If I say, I'm going to bring a spirit of radical welcome as an underpinning. And then the other thing I heard there, I'm sure you all did too, is you didn't say it, but you talked about it, is responding to need. And I think that's a key philosophical underpinning we need to think about in this. It's throughout the day, but really thinking about education as well. What bigger need is there? And that idea of responding to it, and then developing the capacity to do the things the way Howard was describing, and then with the spirit that you gave. I want to turn now to Alfre and Turnaround Arts. So Turnaround Arts was created by the President's Committee for Arts and Humanities, which we're proud to serve on since 2009. And it was our version of responding to need of sorts. We said we want to have a role in education, and where do we fit in? And as it turns out, we fit in trying to turn around some of the nation's most failing schools, generally in extremely underserved conditions as far as economics, and the ability to have access, essentially, to what this country has. So Alfre, you and I have been in lots of different schools, but the one that I always think about kind of the most, in a sense, is Lame Deer, Montana, which is a Native American Northern Cheyenne community, and we've been working in the high school and junior high there for about 2.5, 3 years now. And you came to visit, and it was a year ago, just to give you an example, in the winter when you came, and it was during that cold snap in January. I'm sure you remember how cold it was. And getting to Montana was not the easiest thing in the world, and I remember that you got there before me, and this was my school. I'm a mentor for that school, and Alfre was coming as my guest. And I got there, and I saw you in the lobby of the school, essentially, and the first thing I noticed was it was quiet. And there were a lot of kids, and they were all sitting down, and you were walking from one to the other and putting your hands on them. And I immediately kind of, so this is something I would never consider doing, first of all. And I thought, what were you trying to get at that moment?
Okay, first let me just say it was minus 20.
Oh, God. Little chilly.
It was, actually.
Oh, my God.
I was placing myself with them, making connection, saying, I see you, I'm here, we're all here, and human beings respond to physical contact, to touch, and it grounds people, it grounds situations, just the ability to touch, physically and also across sharing ideas. But especially in a community, and this was Lame Deer, this is a res, and you can't imagine the desolation. But we have witnessed this in a lot of our schools across the country. Also, touching somebody is holding them there because they are in flight constantly. These are traumatized, young people. And I think one of the things that, certainly happened to me and all of us in here, I'm sure, is that when you were young, somebody recognized you, they saw you, and they looked at you, and they expected things from you. And when you expect things from a young person, they get the idea that they can do it, they can deliver. Mm-hmm. And that's the first step. And recognize, because I think all of our children go unrecognized, no matter what their economic situation is that as in this world, we don't see our children, and so they go like this, and then they go, I'm invisible, you can't see me, and then they have things to really, reinforce the fact that they're not there. So you have to, most of the work we do before we get to some extraordinary grade lifting and all of that is to get children to know that I'm an adult, I see you. When you talk to me, look at me, look in my eyes, because it could take, several days if you're there, or weeks, to get a young person to look at you and say their name. They apologize for their presence, and it's just simple things like that. And all of that is humanizing that young person, that student, to say that they have value, because everything around them says they have no value, including the world, their parents. Everybody's in such desperate situation. So that was what I was doing then, and very simple things go a long way, but they all have to do with humanity. I just wanted to sort of chime in on this idea of artists. We are artists, but we go and do these things for a different reason. We're neighbors. I think the impulse to be a citizen, a human being, is stronger even than our art. Our art is a vehicle that helps us express our citizenship.
In a unique way. I mean, the thing is, it's not enough to say you were touching them and communicating in a sense, because there's a unique theater to it. And you were bringing that innately because that is your craft, and you knew how to galvanize attention is a gift of a sort that is unique. I mean, many of the classrooms that we work in that is, in fact, the primary problem right off the bat, is attention, finding a way to do exactly what you described. And the one thing I'm thinking, and there was a bunch of very serious philosophical underpinnings there about essentially connecting as the first step in creating participation. I mean, interestingly, at the end of Serenade today, I felt the need to make sure we stopped for a seriously long time, that we all actually connected it all together and got that moment before we broke. And I think that's that same thing that you hang on, and that's a theatrical skill. But the other thing I wanted to say quickly is the ability to capitalize on the unique qualities of what's in front of you is, to my mind, an artistic habit of mind, as Howard would say, about looking at something and reimagining it and readdressing it and letting it have its moment in the sun in its most palpable way. And what I was thinking specifically of, and this relates to all of our work, is a line that's used on the cover of the program and in one of the songs from Hamilton, the new musical that's in New York. That's just a phenomenal thing that everybody should see. And it's "Who lives, who dies, who tells your story," is this song. Who lives, who dies, who tells your story? And it just is about your story matters, is what I took away from that into this conversation. It's what you do with kids. The next step Alfre did in Blame Deer was getting them to write and tell their story. To write it was the first battle, and then to actually tell it was the next story. This happens in song, and I think, Howard, does this seem real to you as something that actually, it's beyond us? It's not, I can't tell you your own story. As an educational tool of sorts to break through and of unique value, or am I aggrandizing our possibilities?
I have two thoughts. One, for me, story is narrative, words preferably written down, but I think we need to have a much broader notion of story. I don't know the kids in Montana, but that may or may not be their medium. Mm-hmm.
As it turned out,
yeah.
it was a challenge, but through poetry specifically, it was especially relevant. And then in other forms, actually photography. Yeah. Your version of what to take a picture of.
Yeah. Snapshot. But there's another thought I had. One of the problems of the artists in the schools in the 1960s and 70s was not only were the teachers often not in the room, they would use it to have, at the time, a smoke, but the artists came in as people who had abilities and talents which the teachers didn't have, and often made the teachers feel inadequate. And I think it's a very important thing that visiting artists work with teachers, because of course teachers need to do exactly the same thing that Alfre does. The difficulty is you're there every day, and it's different than somebody
doesn't have that.
Somebody coming in from far away. Since I made a couple of cracks about politicians actually do have some of the kinds of skills that you were describing, of being able to hold the attention of an audience, make you feel that you're the most important person in their world. And so thinking about the connections between artists, teachers, and people in the political realm, salespeople and so on, makes the artist more in common rather than this creature from outer space that can intoxicate but then disappears. And I think we don't want that.
Interesting. Well, I think I want to bring out somebody now who can maybe give a little embodiment of what we're talking about a little bit. Karlyn, will you join us if you're back there? I want to introduce you to Karlyn. Oh, she's up here. Karlyn Boens from Chicago, who is a young Chicago author.
Nice to be with you.
Karlyn is 17. She is a slam poetry winner of many competitions. And she's somebody who's a part of our, what we call at the Aspen Institute, our Young Poets program, which she got to come to Aspen last summer and enroll in the famous executive seminar looking at the works from Confucius to Martin Luther King, Adichie, but most importantly, we learned about voice, I thought. So I wanted to invite you here. And you heard, a lot of this discussion about, this and attention and finding within your own self the urge to go large, like Camille. And Howard gave us some very high, bars to meet, I think. But does this reflect in the work you've done and poetry specifically?
It does. It does. First, I want to say thanks for having me here. In poetry and my experience, it's been a journey in finding my own voice and what it means to actually tell a story from your own angle, from your own viewpoint. You guys brought up an interesting point that no one can tell your own story. So through art and through education, it has been really good to figure out who I am as a person. Me personally, growing up as a foster child, struggled with identity. But it was through art and through poetry where I felt free to write down and discover who I was as an individual and then as an artist. And then to know that I can share that piece of me with the world in order to help them discover who they are or raise questions about the relationship that they may have with art. It has, made me feel very free and very loving towards the arts.
Wow, that's wonderful. Would you share a poem with us?
Yeah, sure. My first job, guys, was at a public library. I love literature, I love poetry, but at this library there were two things that I really struggled with, and that was the fact that
We're going to switch out your mic for some reason.
Okay,
Sorry.
cool. That's the fact that this one I don't think is on. Is it on?
There we go.
Okay,
You're
cool.
on. Yeah.
It was the fact that they did not have a large poetry collection, so I struggled with that as a poet, not being able to, in my free time, read a lot of works of poetry. And also, I did not like the African American section in the public library. So, as a poet, I wrote a poem about it. And it's titled, "When I Write a Book, Don't Put It in the African American section of the public library." So that would be the poem that I would share with you guys, okay?
Yes.
Please.
Please.
Yeah.
Can you guys hear me? I feel like I can be pretty loud with my poetry. That's fine?
You go.
Okay, so
Yeah.
I want to just sit this down, actually. When I write a book, don't put it in the African American section of the public library. Label on its spine reads African American. Like our memories too hazy to remember that the color of our skin is black. Got me questioning my roots, my whereabouts, their motive for this label, and I'm thinking, maybe, just maybe if I was a little bit lighter, I could pass for white. And I wouldn't have to read a book from the African American section of the public library because white people don't read that kind of fiction. Books are turned sideways so that everyone can see its inch cube label on its spine. It lays limp, like a warning sign, warning. This book was written by a Negro. Read at your own discretion. Now tell me, do you get sick of hearing our drug dealing, mama on dope, and new member joined the church just to sleep with the pastor type of stories? I'm sorry. That's the only books that get highlighted are the ones that speak of my people's ignorance, which causes white men to come in library and tell me that he'll never read a book from the AA section because they're all ghetto. Well, I guess he's the new KKK. Murder us right away in his mind when he thinks Negroes let their pens hit paper and have nothing else good to write about other than their precious ghettos, and ghettos aren't good. Made me try harder to write about paradise, even though the ghetto was all I ever knew. I'm stereotyped by labels. Pay attention because time is ticking. Racism is now building. Lying. Wake my great-great-great-grandmother up and let her know that libraries are segregating books like they used to segregate people. And when she asks what's the point of this poem, tell her I didn't forget what she wanted to read and Jim Crow said she couldn't enter a library. This poem is for every racist worker at my library and every patron that comes in. Because maybe, just maybe, segregation in public libraries was good. Because black people don't know how to treat white people, and white people still don't know how to treat black people when I write a book. Don't put it in the African American section of the public library because separate doesn't mean equal. Separate is bad. And reading the inch-cube label on my spine will not tell you enough to know that my book is not good. Thank you.
Karlyn Boens. Thank you so much for that. Okay, we are going to close, but I wanted to close with one other reading, and I asked Alfre to do this. She's done this for me once before, and this is a charge. Again, we've talked about streams. This is about streams. There are many topics today, but throughout, to my mind, there's a sense of sticking with it, of not allowing yourself to stop, which God knows you embody. I mean, that's just, who knows the possibility. I mean, I'm just so thrilled to know you. But anyway, will you do your poem? Yeah, yeah. So Alfre's going to do a reading from Sonia Sanchez. Well, you'll see.
We didn't get into this, but I'd like to throw onto the floor as well that I think that we all are artists. Every human being is an artist. Some of us surrender more easily to the creative impulse, but I think it is part of who we are, and when we embrace that and we start to nurture that or respect it, whether it's government or we can find healing about a lot of things that ail us. I mean, there's a reason that since we stood up on two legs around the fire, we have told stories and we have chanted and sang and danced, and I think we're losing the true medicine in our contemporary society. This is called For Sweet Honey, and I don't even need to say anything after you, darling. Sonia Sanchez would be just turning cartwheels right now, but she wrote this for Sweet Honey. The activist, the artist, there's no separation as there is no separation between the sacred and the secular. There is no separation between the science and the art. And this is what our charge is. You know that old gospel song, I'm gonna stay on the battlefield till I die? Sweet Honey in the Rock has sung it for many years. She says, I'm going to stay on the battlefield. I am going to stay on the battlefield. I'm going to stay on the battlefield till I die. I am going to stay on the battlefield. I am going to stay on the battlefield. I'm going to stay on the battlefield till I die. I had come into the city carrying life in my eyes amid rumors of death. Calling out to everyone who would listen, it is time to move us into a new century. Time for freedom. Time for racial and sexual justice. Time for women and children and men for hands unbound. I had come into the city carrying life in my eyes, wearing peaceful breasts, and the spaces between us smile. I had come into the city carrying life in my eyes. I had come into the city carrying life in my eyes. And they followed us in their cars with their computers, and their tongues crawled with caterpillars, and they bumped us off the roads. They turned over our cars. They bombed our buildings, killing our babies. They shot our doctors, maintaining our bodies, and their courts changed into confessionals. But we kept on organizing. We kept on teaching, believing. We kept on doing what we knew was holy, moving to a higher ground. Even though our hands were full of slaughtered teeth, we held out our eyes delirious with grace. We held out our eyes, delirious with grace. I'm going to treat everybody right. I am going to treat everybody right. I'm going to treat everybody right till I die. I'm going to treat everybody right. I'm going to treat everybody right. I'm going to treat everybody right till I die. Come, I say, you standing in domestic bacteria. Come, I say, you standing in double-breasted mornings. Come, I say, come and return to the fight. This fight for the earth. This fight for our children. This fight for life. We need your hurricane voices. We need your sacred hands. I say, come, sister. Come, brother. Come to the battlefield. Come to the rainforest. Come to the barrio. Come into the hood. Come into the schools. Come into the clinics. Come, I say, come into the prisons. Come and caress our spines. I say, come, wrap your hands around justice. Come, wrap your hands with deeds and prayers. You brown ones, you black ones, you yellow ones, you white ones, you lesbian ones, you gay ones. I say, come, 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 come. Come to this battlefield called life, called life, called life. I'm going to stay on the battlefield. I am going to stay on the battlefield. I am going to stay on the battlefield till I die, till I die. I'm going to stay on the battlefield. I am going to stay on the battlefield. I am going to stay on the battlefield till I die.